Welcome, dear readers, to a story that transcends time. Today I invite you to travel with me to the year 1881 to the arid lands of Santa Esperanza, where two lost souls will find in love the strength to defy the conventions of a cruel and rigid era. This is the story of Isabella, a young noblewoman who flees from the golden chains of her cradle, and Diego, a feared man whose hardened heart will be touched by the grace of true love. In a world where destiny seemed written from birth, they will write theirs with ink of courage and passion. From where do you accompany us today? I would love to know from what corner of the world you share this emotional journey with me. Please let me know in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like, so that more people can discover these stories that nourish the soul. Year 1881. Santa Esperanza, a small settlement in the dusty hills of the frontier territory. The evening sun painted the hills surrounding Santa Esperanza ochre when the thunder of broken wheels broke the silence of the road. The carriage lay tilted against a cliff, its elegant noble woods now covered with dust and rust from time. An hour had passed since the coachman, upon hearing the first distant shots, had abandoned his post, fleeing like a ghost among the bushes. Isabella Montemayor released her delicate hands from the window's edge, feeling how the light blue linen of her dress adhered to her skin from heat and fear. The ivory lace embroidery that adorned her bodice now seemed grotesquely out of place in that harsh vastness. Her eyes, the color of liquid amber, swept the horizon in search of hope, but only found the settlement that stretched before her like an open wound on the earth. With uncertain steps, Isabella walked toward the first adobe houses. The wind brought her the aroma of tanned leather, tobacco and sweat, essences completely foreign to the rose and lavender gardens of her childhood. Each step resonated like a declaration she no longer belonged to the world she had left behind, but she had not yet found her place in this new universe. Three men with sun-weathered faces and storm-beaten lives emerged from a tavern, their gazes like invisible claws fixed upon the delicate figure advancing down the main street. Isabella felt her breathing accelerate when she understood that her fine clothes betrayed her as a stranger, as someone who didn't belong to this place where survival was a daily art. "Look what the wind brought us," murmured the tallest one, adjusting his hat while beginning to follow her. The house doors closed one by one like petals folding before a storm. No one would intervene. In Santa Esperanza, everyone looked after themselves, and a lost noble lady was nobody's responsibility. Isabella pressed against her chest the small bag that contained her last possessions, a few coins, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, and a letter that would never be sent. Her steps quickened, but so did those of her pursuers. Terror began to nest in her throat like a black bird that had come to stay forever. Had it all been in vain? Her escape, her courage, her decision to break the golden chains that bound her to a life she didn't choose? Tears threatened to flow, but something within her, a small but inextinguishable flame, whispered that the end of her story had not yet arrived. The galloping emerged from the horizon like thunder announces the storm. The sound of hooves against dry earth resonated in Isabella's soul like a promise whose meaning she didn't yet understand. A black horse, magnificent in its strength, approached, carrying on its back a man who seemed carved from the same rough stone as the hills. Diego Herrera appeared like an apparition, born from the tales whispered by grandmothers, by the warmth of home. Tall, of robust build, he wore a long coat that billowed behind him like the wings of a bird of prey. His dark hat shadowed a face where years had chiseled lines of experience and pain. His beard, perfectly trimmed, framed a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to smile, but that preserved an innate nobility that no adversity had managed to break. The three pursuers stopped as if they had crashed against an invisible wall. In Santa Esperanza, there were men to be feared, but Diego Herrera was the man everyone feared. His past was a closed book, written with ink of fire and blood, and his present a silent warning to whoever dared challenge him. Without uttering a word, Diego extended his hand to Isabella. His eyes, dark as a moonless night, met hers in a moment that seemed suspended in time. "Get on," he told her, and in that single word there was a protection that Isabella had never known. She hesitated only an instant, Everything in her education screamed at her not to accept help from a stranger, especially one whose mere presence made men hardened by violence flee. But something in Diego's gaze, a brutal honesty and integrity that needed no words to manifest itself, reassured her in an inexplicable way. Isabella took the extended hand and felt the strength with which he lifted her to the saddle. The warmth of that contact spread through her arm, as if she had touched a brazier in the middle of winter. Behind him, surrounded by his arms without them touching her, Isabella experienced for the first time in many months the sensation of being truly safe. They rode in silence, moving away from the settlement toward the hills that rose like giant sentinels. The wind carried with it the aroma of sage and damp earth, and Isabella closed her eyes, allowing this new world to envelop her like a protective mantle. Diego's house emerged among the folds of the hills like a well-kept secret. Built of stone and dark wood, it had the solidity of something that had been erected to resist not only climate storms, but also those of the human heart. It wasn't elegant according to the canons Isabella knew, but it possessed an austere beauty that spoke of true refuge. Upon arriving, Diego dismounted first and then helped her down. His hands, calloused but gentle, rested on her waist only for the necessary time. "Here you will be safe," he murmured, and in those words Isabella heard not only a promise, but the beginning of something she didn't yet dare to name. Diego's house kept in its walls the silence of solitary years. Isabella crossed the threshold and felt how peace received her like a long-awaited embrace. The furniture, carved in noble and dark woods, spoke of a man who valued functionality above ostentation, but who didn't despise beauty in its purest form. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, filling the space with a golden warmth that contrasted with the cold Isabella had felt in her soul for so many weeks. On the mantelpiece, some books rested alongside a well-maintained rifle, symbols of a man who had learned that both wisdom and strength were necessary for survival. Diego moved through his home with the silent grace of one who had learned to live with himself. He prepared coffee in a tin coffee pot, and the aroma of the roasted bean mixed with that of the wood fire, creating an olfactory symphony that awakened in Isabella a nostalgia for something she had never experienced, the sensation of a true home. "I won't ask what you're fleeing from," said Diego while offering her a steaming cup. "Everyone has the right to their secrets, and everyone deserves a chance to start over." Isabella wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling how the heat transferred through the ceramic. "I'm fleeing from a destiny that others wrote for me," she confessed, surprising herself with her own honesty. "From a marriage that would be my living tomb, from a family that sees in me only a bargaining chip." Diego's gaze softened imperceptibly. "I was also pursued once," he murmured, "and no one appeared to extend a hand to me. That's why I'm here in these places where a man can be judged by what he does not, by what others expect him to do." On that first night, Isabella slept in the guest room between sheets that smelled of wild lavender. For the first time in months, she didn't dream of carriages taking her to altars where a stranger waited. Instead, she dreamed of golden hills and dark eyes that promised protection without asking for anything in return. At dawn, Diego had already prepared breakfast, fresh eggs from his own hen's bread. He baked himself, and honey he collected from hives, hidden among the oaks. Isabella watched his hands while he worked, large hands marked by small scars that told stories he didn't narrate, but that moved with unexpected delicacy when serving food. "I don't know how long I can stay," said Isabella, though in her heart she already knew she never wanted to leave. "Time isn't measured in days when it comes to healing," replied Diego. "Stay as long as you need. Here no one will judge you, no one will pressure you, no one will decide for you." In those words, Isabella found something she had searched for all her life, without knowing the freedom to simply be who she was. Without masks, without expectations, without the weight of a surname that defined her before she could do it herself. Could this refuge become something more than a temporary hideout? Could Diego's hardened heart open to shelter the love that was already beginning to germinate in silence? The following days flowed like a tranquil river after the storm. Isabella discovered that life in the hills had a different rhythm from the aristocratic salons where she had grown up. Here, each dawn brought concrete tasks, tangible purposes the satisfaction of creating something with one's own hands. Diego watched her discreetly while she tried to perform the most basic tasks. Seeing that young woman with delicate hands struggle with the well rope to draw water or stumble with her long skirts while trying to collect firewood awakened in him a tenderness he believed buried forever. "Not like that," murmured Diego when he saw her struggle with the axe to split logs. He approached from behind and, without touching her directly, guided her movements. The secret is to find the wood's weak point, not to use brute force. Isabella felt the warmth of his presence so close that she could perceive the aroma of his skin, a mixture of leather, rustic soap, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel protected and vulnerable at the same time. When the axe finally split the log in two, the small cry of triumph she emitted drew from Diego the first genuine smile he had given in years. "You're stronger than you imagine," he told her, and in his eyes Isabella glimpsed something that made her blush admiration. They spent the afternoon sitting on the porch, contemplating how the sun tinted the hills with impossible colors. Isabella had begun to wear simpler dresses she had found in a trunk, pieces that had belonged to Diego's sister deceased years ago. The transformation was remarkable. Without the tight corsets and layers of lace, she moved with a naturalness that seemed to free her from something more than uncomfortable clothing. "Don't you miss your previous life?" Diego asked her one afternoon while they drank wild herb tea. Isabella considered the question, surprised to discover that the answer was simpler than expected. "I miss the comfort, the books, the music," she confessed. "But I don't miss the golden cage. Here for the first time, I feel like I'm breathing real." "There," Diego nodded slowly. "I left soldier life behind 5 years ago. I had forgotten what it meant to wake up without expecting each day to be the last." "What brought you here?" Isabella dared to ask. Diego's eyes clouded momentarily. A man can do terrible things when he believes he serves a just cause. When he finally understands that there are no just causes, only men trying to survive, he has two options: become a monster, or find a place where he can remember who he was before the world hardened him. That night, Isabella remained awake for a long time, thinking about Diego's words. She wondered what secrets his heart guarded, what ghosts visited him on sleepless nights, what pain had carved those deep lines around his eyes. But she also wondered something more disturbing. Why did this man's proximity awaken in her sensations she didn't even know existed? Why did the sound of his voice calm her during the day and keep her awake at night? Why was she beginning to desire that his calloused hands touch her with the same delicacy with which he handled his work tools? Love, Isabella understood in the quiet of dawn, arrived like a silent thief, without announcing itself, without asking permission, transforming everything in its path until nothing remained of the world one knew before. The first storm arrived at the end of the second week, announcing itself with a wind that made the centuries-old oaks whisper secrets. Isabella was in the kitchen learning to prepare bread, following a recipe Diego had patiently taught her when the sky burst in silver cascades that struck the roof like thousands of tiny drums. Diego entered soaked after protecting the animals, and seeing him shake the water from his hair like a wild wolf, Isabella felt something in her chest contract in a delicious and alarming way. He approached the fire, and she offered him a towel, carefully avoiding their fingers touching when passing it. "The storm will last all night," murmured Diego, and in his voice there was something that wasn't only concern about the weather. They sat together before the fire, closer than usual due to the cold that filtered through the windows. Isabella had begun to mend a shirt of Diego's that had torn during work, and he carved a small wooden bird, a habit that he had confessed helped him keep his hands busy and his mind serene. "How did you learn to do this?" asked Isabella, watching how the piece of wood transformed under his skillful fingers. "My grandfather was a carpenter," replied Diego without lifting his gaze. "He said that a man who can create beauty with his hands will never be completely lost, no matter what darkness he has known." Lightning illuminated the room, immediately followed by thunder that made the windows tremble. Isabella startled involuntarily, and Diego, without thinking, extended his arm to protect her. For a moment that felt like an eternity. She remained nestled against his side, feeling the quiet strength of his breathing, the warmth of his body through the damp shirt. "Don't be afraid," whispered Diego, and his voice had a hoarseness that hadn't been there before. "These storms are noisy, but they pass quickly." Isabella raised her gaze to look at him and found that he was already looking at her. Their faces were so close that she could see the small golden spots in his dark eyes count each of the lines that time had drawn around them. The world reduced to that minimal space between them, charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the exterior storm. "Diego," she murmured, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. "Isabella," he responded, and there was in his voice a reverence that made her tremble. It was he who broke the moment, moving away gently but firmly. "You should rest," he said, and although his tone was gentle, Isabella perceived the internal struggle taking place behind his words. That night neither of them slept. Isabella remained awake, listening to his steps on the other side of the wall, knowing that he too struggled with thoughts he didn't dare face. There was between them an attraction that grew like grass after rain, natural, inevitable, transformative. At dawn, when the storm had passed, they met in the kitchen as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Each glance was more intense. Each casual touch of their hands when passing objects sent electric currents through their bodies. Each silence was charged with unspoken words. Diego worked on repairing a fence damaged by the wind, and Isabella helped, him by passing tools. Seeing her there with cheeks flushed from effort, hair escaping from her hairstyle hands stained with earth but proud of her work, awakened in Diego a feeling he had sworn never to experience again. "I don't know at what moment it happened," confessed Diego suddenly without stopping hammering the wood, "but you already mean something to me that I don't know how to name." Isabella dropped the hammer she was holding. Her heart beat so strongly that she was sure he could hear it. "For me too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me as much as it fills me with joy. Could two wounded hearts heal together, or would the past that both carried on their backs rise like an insurmountable barrier between them?" The dust rose in the distance like a golden warning against the blue sky when Isabella saw the party approaching. Along the path that led to the house, 3 riders advanced with the determination of those who carried authority and weren't accustomed to being denied anything. At the front rode a man whose mere presence emanated danger, Captain Esteban Vasquez. At 45 years old, Vasquez had converted his uniform into a tool of extortion more than justice. His weathered face showed the marks of a life dedicated to bending the law to his convenience, and his small calculating eyes evaluated everything in terms of personal gain. The badge on his chest shone in the sun like a warning, but Isabella knew there was no honor behind that metal. Diego emerged from the house upon hearing the hooves. His transformation was instantaneous. Where moments before there had been a man, at peace now stood the warrior who had learned to survive in a world without mercy. His hand rested casually but strategically near the pistol he wore on his belt. "Diego Herrera," greeted Vasquez without dismounting, in a tone that pretended to be cordial but distilled threat. "It's been a while since we've seen each other." "Not long enough," Vasquez replied Diego, and in his voice there was a coldness Isabella had never heard. "What brings you to my lands?" "Official business," smiled Vasquez, but his eyes swept the house as if he were evaluating its value. "I'm looking for a noble lady who disappeared, Isabella Montemayor. Her family is very worried and has placed a generous reward for information about her whereabouts." Isabella felt her blood freeze in her veins. From the kitchen window she watched the scene, but she knew she couldn't remain hidden forever. Diego wouldn't betray her, she was sure of that. But at what price? What consequences would his protection bring him? "I haven't seen any noble lady around these parts," replied Diego with a calm that contrasted with the tension that could be felt in the air. "As you know, noble ladies don't usually venture into such rustic places." Vasquez emitted a dry laugh. "How curious. Some merchants from the settlement swore they saw a woman of refined appearance arriving a few weeks ago. They said she was last seen in your company." "The merchants of the settlement say many things, especially when there's money involved," replied Diego. "You should know that better than anyone." Vasquez's smile became dangerous. "Careful, Diego. Your past gives you a certain reputation, but my badge gives me authority. I could search your property if I deemed it necessary." At that moment, Isabella made the decision that would change everything. She wouldn't allow Diego to face the consequences of protecting her while she hid like a coward. She opened the door and came out walking with the dignity she had learned in aristocratic salons, but with a determination forged in the hills of Santa Esperanza. "That won't be necessary," she said, with a clear and firm voice. "Isabella Montemayor no longer exists." Vasquez smiled triumphantly, but his expression changed when he saw that Isabella deliberately placed herself beside Diego, not as a prisoner waiting to be rescued, but as a woman who had chosen her place. "Here there is only a free woman who decided to make her life away from those who intended to control her," continued Isabella, and each word was an act of rebellion. "If you have business to discuss, it will be with me and with the man who offered me protection when no one else did." Diego looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Isabella," he murmured. "No." She interrupted him gently, placing her hand on his arm. "It's my decision, my life, my choice." Vasquez observed the scene with calculating eyes. The reward was tempting, but confrontation with Diego Herrera could cost him more than he would gain. Besides, there was something in the woman's determination that told him it wouldn't be easy to take her against her will. "This isn't over," he threatened, pulling the reins of his horse. "The Montemayor family has influences that reach very far. I'll be back." As the party moved away, Isabella and Diego remained motionless side by side, watching the figures disappear in the distance. When they were no more than dots on the horizon, Diego turned to her. "Do you know what you just did?" he asked, and in his voice there was admiration and fear in equal parts. "Yes," replied Isabella, and for the first time in her life she felt completely in control of her destiny. "I just chose my life." Diego took her in his arms then, and the kiss they shared was a declaration of war against the world, and a promise that whatever happened, they would face it together. The days following the encounter with Vasquez passed under a cloud of expectant tension. Diego knew that the corrupt captain would fulfill his threat, and this time he wouldn't come just to negotiate. Isabella had crossed a line from which there was no return, and although he admired her courage, he understood that the consequences were just beginning to manifest. "You need to learn to defend yourself," Diego told her one morning while cleaning his rifle. "Men like Vasquez don't understand honor or laws when there's money involved." Isabella watched the precise movements of his hands as he dismantled and reassembled the weapon. There was a lethal efficiency in each gesture that reminded her that the man she had fallen in love with carried in his past chapters written with gunpowder and steel. "Teach me," she said simply. Diego looked up, surprised by the determination in her voice. "Isabella, using a firearm isn't like embroidering or playing piano. It's necessary," she interrupted him. "If I'm going to live in this world, if I'm going to be by your side, I won't be a burden that needs constant protection. Teach me." The lessons began that same afternoon. Diego first taught her how to hold the pistol, how to feel its weight, how to respect its destructive power. Isabella's hands trembled at first, not from fear of the weapon but from Diego's proximity. As he adjusted her posture, guided her arms, whispered instructions in her ear. "Breathing is key," he murmured, his hands covering hers on the grip. "Inhale, aim, exhale slowly, and squeeze the trigger in the space between breaths." When Isabella fired for the first time, the thunder startled her, but her determination didn't waver. Again and again she practiced, until her hands stopped trembling and her shots began to hit the target. Diego watched her with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Pride for her courage, melancholy because he knew he was definitively pulling her away from the world of innocence where she had been born. The nights were for more subtle but equally important preparations. Diego taught her the weak points of the house escape routes, how to move silently among shadows. They reinforced doors and windows, prepared hiding places for provisions and ammunition. "How do you know all these things?" asked Isabella one night while he showed her how to disarm a man with bare hands. Diego stopped his eyes, lost in memories he didn't wish to share. "During the war, I learned that survival requires knowledge that no man should need. I promised I would never use those skills again, but now you have something worth protecting," completed Isabella, understanding. "I have everything worth protecting," he corrected, and the intensity in his voice made her shiver. That night, sitting on the porch under a star-sown sky, Diego spoke. To her of his past with a brutal honesty she hadn't expected. He told her about the horrors of war, about the impossible decisions he had had to make, about the moment when he understood he had lost his soul in the name of a cause he didn't understand. "When I arrived here, I was convinced I didn't deserve redemption," he confessed. "I believed the best I could do was live in solitude without harming anyone else with my presence." Isabella took his hand in hers, feeling the calluses that told, stories of honest work of years dedicated to rebuilding not only a life, but also a soul. "All people carry shadows," she murmured, "but we also have the capacity to choose whether we let those shadows define us, or if we decide to walk toward the light." Diego looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "How can you have so much wisdom being so young?" "Because I learned that wisdom doesn't come from years, but from suffering that we decide to transform into understanding," replied Isabella. "And because I fell in love with a man who taught me that true value lies in choosing love over fear, even when the whole world seems to conspire against us." Under the starlight, they promised each other they would face together whatever came. They didn't know when Vasquez would arrive, nor with how many men, nor what price they would have to pay for their happiness. But they knew they had found something worth any sacrifice, a love that had transformed both of them into better versions of themselves. Would this love be enough to survive the approaching storm, or would the cruel world surrounding them manage to destroy what they had built with such delicacy? The days passed with a deceptive calm that reminded of the quiet before a hurricane. Isabella had developed a routine that included shooting lessons in the morning's work in the house and garden during the day, and long conversations by the fire at night. But behind this apparent normalcy, both felt the pressure of time running out. One afternoon, while Isabella practiced with the pistol, Diego received an unexpected visit from an old acquaintance, Miguel Santos, a traveling merchant who had been his companion in arms during the war. Miguel arrived dusty and worried with news that confirmed Diego's worst fears. "Vasquez has been recruiting men," Miguel informed him while they drank whiskey in the kitchen. "He offers easy money to anyone willing to accompany him. He says he's coming for a fugitive, but in the settlement they comment that he's planning something bigger." Isabella listened from the doorway, pretending to occupy herself with dinner preparation, but each word stuck in her heart like a splinter. "Service." "How many men?" asked Diego with the calm voice of one who had learned to control his emotions in extreme situations. "6, maybe 8, replied Miguel. "Desperate people willing to do anything for a few coins. They're not soldiers, but armed, they're dangerous." That night, after Miguel left Diego and Isabella remained awake, talking in whispers about what was approaching. The house which had been their refuge now felt like a besieged fortress. "We could flee," suggested Isabella. "Disappear in the night, seek refuge in another territory." Diego shook his head. "A man can flee once, maybe twice, but there comes a moment when he must stand and defend what is his. This place is my home, and you are my heart. I won't flee again." Isabella understood then that Diego had made a decision that went beyond simple survival. It was about recovering his honor, demonstrating, to himself more than to anyone, that he was capable of fighting for something worthwhile. "Then we fight," said Isabella, and in her voice there was a determination that surprised even herself. "But I want you to know something before anything might separate us." She sat up in bed and looked him in the eyes in the dim light. "I love you, Diego Alejandro Herrera, not as the girl I was when I arrived here, but as the woman I became by your side. I love you with an intensity I didn't know existed, and if tomorrow were our last day, I want you to know that every moment with you was worth all the risks we've taken." Diego took her in his arms with a tenderness that contrasted with the strength of his calloused hands. "And I love you with a devotion I believed impossible," he whispered against her hair. "You were a stranger when you arrived, but now you're the reason it's worth waking up each morning." They made love that night with a passion tinged with desperation, as if they could stop time with the intensity of their surrender. Each caress was a promise, each kiss a declaration of war against the destiny that threatened to separate them. At dawn, Diego began the final preparations. He checked each weapon, each ammunition, each detail of the defense he had planned. Isabella helped him in silence, both conscious that words were superfluous when hearts had already said everything important. "There's something else you should know," said Diego while loading his rifle. "My full name is Diego Alejandro Herrera de la Cruz. I come from a noble family that lost everything in the war. Like you, I fled from a destiny others had written for me." Isabella smiled despite the tension. "Then we are two fugitives from aristocracy who found their true home in the dusty hills of Santa Esperanza." "Yes," agreed Diego, "and here we'll write our own ending." As the sun rose over the hills, both knew that this day would define not only their future, but also who they had chosen to be. Love had transformed them, but now they had to demonstrate if that transformation was deep enough to survive the most difficult test. Would they be able to protect what they had built together, or would the forces conspiring against them manage to destroy their newly found happiness? The sun had barely begun its ascent when the sound of multiple hooves resonated. Among the hills, like the beating of war drums, Isabella felt her heart accelerate upon seeing the dust rising in the distance, but her hands remained steady on the pistol Diego had taught her to use. Vasquez arrived, just as he had promised, but not only with men, he had also brought his arrogance, and his certainty that money and brute force were enough to bend any will. 8 riders accompanied him, hard faces marked by desperation and greed, men who had sold their honor for a few coins, but who retained the danger of those who had nothing to lose. "Diego Herrera!" shouted Vasquez from the distance his voice carried. "By the morning wind. This is your last chance to surrender to reason. Give me the woman and no one will be hurt." Diego appeared on the porch, his figure silhouetted against the dark wood of the house like a statue carved in determination. His rifle rested with deceptive casualness in his arms, but Isabella knew that every fiber of his being was tense, like the string of a bow about to fire. "The only reason I recognize," replied Diego, with a voice that carried clear to where the attackers were, "is the one that tells me a man must protect whom he loves. Isabella is here by her own will, and here she will stay as long as I have breath in my body." Isabella watched from the bedroom window as they had agreed. Her role was to keep watch on the flanks of the house, while Diego faced the frontal attack. But seeing him there alone against 8 men awakened in her a protective fury she didn't know she possessed. Vasquez made a signal, and 3 of his men headed toward the back of the house. It was the movement Diego had anticipated, the obvious tactic of any attacker: divide the defender's attention and attack from multiple fronts. The first shot resonated like thunder, but it didn't come from Vasquez's weapons. Diego had fired at one of the men trying to approach from the flank, not to kill him, but to warn that he wouldn't stop at anything. The bullet tore off the riders, who moved away cursing. "The next one won't miss," shouted Diego. The battle began then in earnest. Shots burst from multiple directions, splintering the house's wood-breaking glass, filling the air with acrid smoke and the deadly whistle of bullets. Isabella fired for the first time at a real attacker, feeling how the weapon recoiled in her hands, seeing how her shot hit the arm of the man trying to enter through the back window. The combat extended for hours that seemed like years. Diego moved through the house like a lethal ghost, appearing at different windows, constantly changing position using his knowledge of the terrain to stay always one step ahead of his attackers. Isabella discovered she had a natural aim that surprised even Diego, and more importantly, she discovered she was capable of firing without hesitation when it came to protecting the man she loved. It was during a moment of relative calm when Vasquez played his most dangerous card. He set fire to a pair of improvised arrows and shot them at the house's roof. The dry wood caught fire immediately, and soon the flames began to spread with hungry voracity. "Come out now, Diego," shouted Vasquez, "or you'll burn along with your precious lady." The heat became unbearable quickly. Smoke filled the rooms, making it difficult to breathe and even more difficult to maintain accuracy in shooting. Diego made a desperate decision. He would go out to face Vasquez face to face, trusting that his superior aim and combat experience would give him the advantage he needed. "Isabella," he shouted over the noise of the flames, "when I go out, you escape through the back window. There's a saddled horse behind the stable. "No," she replied, coughs, interrupting her words. "I won't leave you alone." "It's an order," roared Diego, but in his eyes there was love, not authority. The final confrontation occurred in the courtyard, surrounded by smoke and flames that converted the scene into something infernal. Diego and Vasquez measured each other like gladiators in a mortal arena, each trusting in his abilities to determine not only who would live, but who had been right. The duel lasted seconds that felt eternal. 2 shots resonated almost simultaneously. Vasquez fell seriously wounded but alive. Diego remained standing, touching the side, where a bullet had grazed his ribs without causing mortal damage. Vasquez's men, seeing their leader fall and understanding that the promised money wasn't worth their lives, fled like shadows dispersed by dawn. Diego and Isabella met in the middle of the smoke and ashes, embracing with the desperation of those who had been about to lose everything. The house burned behind them, destroying objects but not memories, eliminating the physical refuge, but not the emotional one they had built together. "We won," murmured Isabella against his chest. "Yes," replied Diego, "but the price—" Isabella, separated to look him in the eyes. "The price of freedom is always high," she said, "but paying it together makes it bearable." While the flames consumed the house where they had discovered love, Diego and Isabella embraced, knowing they had saved the only thing that truly mattered: their right to choose their own destiny and the promise to build it together no matter what obstacles the future might reserve. The ashes still smoldered when Diego and Isabella began to walk among the remains of what had been their home. The stone structure had resisted, but the wood furniture, the small daily treasures that had given warmth to the house, everything had been devoured by the flames. However, as they contemplated the devastation, neither of them felt true despair. "It's just wood and metal," murmured Diego, pushing aside a burnt board with his foot. "Houses can be rebuilt." Isabella approached what had been the mantelpiece and found miraculously intact among the ashes the small wooden bird that Diego had been carving. She picked it up carefully, cleaning the soot from its delicate carved feathers. "Look," she told him, extending it, "some things survive storms." Diego took the small sculpture in his large hands, amazed that something so fragile had resisted destruction. "My grandfather said that true art was indestructible because it's born from the soul, not from the hands." During the following weeks, they worked together to clear the debris and begin reconstruction. Isabella had changed so much that sometimes Diego watched her work, carrying beams, mixing adobe, laying the foundations of the new structure, and marveled at the transformation. The delicate young woman who had arrived fleeing had become a woman of unbreakable inner strength. It was during one of those working afternoons, while they rested under the shade of an oak, that Isabella saw the familiar dust that announced visitors. But this time she felt no fear. She had learned the difference between those who arrived as predators and those who did so with other purposes. The approaching carriage was elegant, too elegant for Santa Esperanza. Its horses were purebred, its leather upholstery fine, its fittings gleaming under the sun. Isabella recognized the family crest painted on the door before she could distinguish the faces of its occupants. "My family," she murmured, and in her voice there was a serenity that surprised Diego. From the carriage descended 2 figures who seemed to have stepped out of an aristocratic portrait: Don Fernando Montemayor, her father, a man of 55 years, whose erect bearing hadn't managed to disguise the lines of worry that furrowed his face, and Doña Carmen Sandoval, her stepmother, a woman of 38 years, whose cold beauty was perfectly framed by a dress that cost more than what most people in Santa Esperanza earned in a year. "Isabella," said Don Fernando, and in his voice there was a mixture of relief and reproach. That she knew very well. "We've come to take you home." Isabella stood up slowly, conscious of how she must look, hair loose, hands stained with earth, the simple and practical dress she had adopted for work. She was the antithesis of everything her family considered appropriate for a lady of her position. "This is my home," she replied calmly. Doña Carmen made a dismissive gesture toward the smoking ruins. "This, Isabella, please. This is barbarism. This is freedom," corrected Isabella, walking to where Diego waited in silence. She placed herself beside him, not behind him, like a woman seeking protection, but next to him as an equal companion. Father, stepmother, I present to you Diego Alejandro Herrera de la Cruz, the man I love and with whom I've decided to make my life. Don Fernando evaluated Diego with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to judging people's value by their usefulness. What he saw, the proud posture, the direct gaze, the calloused hands that spoke of honest work, didn't fit with his prejudices about frontier inhabitants. Isabella, said Don Fernando, trying to maintain patience, I understand you may feel gratitude toward this man for protecting you during your adventure, but it's time you return to your place, to your true life. Don Rodrigo Velasco is still willing to honor the matrimonial commitment despite the circumstances. Isabella felt a bitter laugh rise from her throat. My true life? Do you refer to the life where I was a bargaining chip to seal commercial alliances, where my opinions didn't matter, my desires were irrelevant, and my only function was to produce heirs for a man I barely knew? It was your duty, intervened Doña Carmen coldly. As a woman of your position, you had responsibilities to your family, to your social class. My only responsibility, replied Isabella, taking Diego's hand, is to myself and to the person I chose to love. Don Fernando approached, lowering his voice, as if he wanted to make the conversation more intimate. Isabella, be reasonable. What future can you have here living like a peasant without the refinements you've been accustomed to? What will become of you when the novelty wears off and you understand what you've lost? Isabella looked at her father with a mixture of love and pity. I lost the golden chains, father, and I gained something I never had in our house, the freedom to be who I really am. It was then when Diego spoke for the first time, his deep and serene voice cutting through the tension like a well-sharpened sword. Don Fernando, he said, inclining his head in a respectful but not servile greeting, I understand your concern for your daughter. It's natural for a father to desire the best for her, but the best cannot be defined by others, but only by the person who must live that life. Don Fernando straightened clearly, not accustomed to men of inferior class addressing him with such confidence. And what can you offer her, he asked with disdain. Hard work, privations, a life of anonymity in this place forgotten by God. Diego smiled then, and in that smile there was a wisdom that years of privilege hadn't taught Don Fernando. I can offer her respect, freedom to make her own decisions, and a love that doesn't depend on her surname or her dowry, but on who she really is. I can offer her the opportunity to build something of her own, instead of inheriting something others built for her. The conversation extended for hours, with arguments ranging from emotional pleas to veiled threats. But Isabella remained firm, and gradually both her father and stepmother began to understand that the young woman who had left no longer existed. In her place was a woman who had found her own voice and wasn't willing to silence it for any price. Finally, when the sun began to decline, Don Fernando admitted defeat. If this is truly your choice, he said with a tired voice, then I suppose I have no choice but to respect it. But the doors of the family home will always be open to you. Isabella hugged her father with genuine affection. Thank you, father, but I already have a home. As the carriage moved away toward the horizon, Isabella and Diego stood among the ruins of their house, hand in hand, watching their connection to the world that had formed them, but no longer defined them definitively, fade away. Do you regret it? Asked Diego softly. Isabella turned to him, her eyes shining with a determination he had learned to adore. The only thing I would regret would be not having the courage to follow my heart. Everything else is just details. Could they really build a new life on the ashes of the previous one, or would the world continue conspiring against their happiness until it managed to separate them forever? The weeks following her family's visit passed in laborious tranquility. Isabella and Diego had immersed themselves in rebuilding the house with a determination that transformed each beam, placed each wall, raised into a declaration of permanence. They were no longer building a temporary refuge, they were constructing a home destined to last generations. The new structure took shape with a beauty different from the previous one, broader with larger windows that invited light to fill every corner, designed to be functional but also beautiful. Isabella had insisted on including a small but well-thought library, while Diego had added a workshop where he could continue with his wood carvings during rainy afternoons. One morning, while Isabella planted wild roses in what would be the front garden, she heard the sound of approaching hooves. She no longer startled at these sounds. She had learned to distinguish between hostile and peaceful arrivals, but something in the rhythm of this gallop seemed familiar. The rider who appeared on the trail wasn't a threatening stranger, but Miguel Santos Diego's old friend. But his face showed an urgency that immediately put Isabella on alert. He dismounted before his horse came to a complete stop and ran to the house. "Diego," he shouted, "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." Isabella dropped the small shovel she had been using and ran to the house. She found Miguel in the kitchen, sweaty and agitated, drinking water directly from the pitcher, as if he had ridden for days without rest. "What's happening?" asked Diego, drying his hands on a cloth after leaving his construction tools. Miguel looked at Isabella with uncertainty. It's complicated, friend. Maybe we should talk alone." "Isabella is my partner in everything," replied Diego firmly. "There are no secrets between us." Miguel nodded, breathed deeply, and began his account. "Men have come asking about you. They're not like Vasquez and his band of mercenaries. These are real military, federals." Isabella felt her blood freeze. "What do they want?" "It seems someone in the capital has been removing old files. They found irregularities in war reports. They suspect certain officers made decisions that weren't exactly orthodox." Diego had become very quiet, but Isabella could see the tension accumulating in his shoulders, like a storm about to break. "What kind of irregularities?" he asked with a controlled voice. Miguel looked at him with compassion. "Diego, you and I know that war forced us all to do things that in peacetime would have been unthinkable. But now that everything's over, there are people who want to point fingers, find scapegoats, for the atrocities we all committed." Isabella approached Diego instinctively. She could feel how the past he had carefully buried was beginning to emerge like a corpse floating in troubled waters. "How much time do we have?" asked Diego. "Days, maybe a week," replied Miguel. "They're moving slowly because they don't want to alarm the civilian population, but they're determined to find you." That night, Diego told Isabella the whole truth about his military past. He spoke of a massacre he had ordered, stopped disobeying direct orders from his superiors. He told her how he had saved the lives of hundreds of civilians, but in doing so, had allowed enemy combatants to escape to fight another day. "At the moment I knew it was right," he explained, looking at the flames dancing in the new fireplace. "But technically, I disobeyed direct orders in wartime. That's desertion treason, crimes punishable by death." Isabella listened to every word without interrupting, seeing how the strong man she knew revealed himself. Vulnerable human tormented by decisions he had made when there were no correct options available. "So now you also have to choose," murmured Isabella when he finished his account. "Flee again or face the consequences." Diego looked at her with eyes that reflected years of exhaustion. "I'm tired of fleeing, Isabella, but I also can't ask you to share the fate of a fugitive." Isabella rose from the chair where they had been sitting and walked to the window. Outside, the stars shone over the hills that had become their home. For long minutes she contemplated the landscape, while reflecting on the options they had. When she turned to Diego, her eyes shone with a determination he had learned to recognize and admire. "There's a third option," she said. "Not flee, but also not wait passively for them to come for you." "What do you mean?" Isabella approached and took his hands in hers. "I mean it's time for Diego Alejandro Herrera de la Cruz to stop hiding and face his accusers not as a fugitive, but as the honorable man I know you are." Diego frowned. "Isabella, you don't understand. If I surrender—" "I'm not referring to surrendering," she interrupted him. "I'm referring to gathering the people who were there, the civilians you saved, the soldiers who served under your command. I'm referring to building a real defense, to demonstrating that what you did wasn't treason, but heroism." The idea was risky, almost impossible. It meant exposing himself trusting in a justice system that rarely favored those who challenged authority. But it also meant the possibility of clearing his name once and for all, of living without the constant shadow of the past. "Would you be willing to risk everything we've built?" asked Diego. Isabella smiled, and in that smile was all the strength of the love that had grown between them. "I already risked everything once when I decided to stay with you instead of returning to the safety of my family. Now I'm simply willing to risk everything again, but this time to ensure we can truly live free." Would they have the courage to face together not only the external forces threatening their happiness, but also the ghosts of the past that had pursued Diego for so many years? Or would this new test finally be the one that managed to destroy the love they had built so carefully? Dawn arrived tinged with a clarity that seemed to foretell irreversible changes. Isabella woke before Diego and found him already sitting on the edge of the bed contemplating his hands, with the expression of a man weighing decisions that would define the rest of his life. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked softly, approaching to sit beside him. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," replied Diego without lifting his gaze. "In all my life, I've made two types of decisions, those imposed on me by circumstances, and those I made fleeing from consequences. I've never voluntarily faced a problem when I had the option to avoid it." Isabella placed her hand over his. "But now you have something worth fighting for, something that didn't exist when you made all those previous decisions." "What?" "A future you truly want to live," replied Isabella, "and someone who wants to live it with you." They had breakfast in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but conscious of the other's comforting presence. It was Diego who finally broke the silence. "If we're going to do this," he said, "we have to do it right. We can't improvise." Isabella smiled. "Then let's plan." They spent the day outlining a strategy that was as bold as it was necessary. Miguel had returned in the morning with more information. The federal military had established a temporary base in the nearest settlement and was systematically asking about Diego. But he had also brought encouraging news. "There are people who remember you, Diego," he had told him. "Entire families who survived thanks to your decision. Some have even come asking if they can help in some way." The idea began to take shape instead of waiting to be arrested or fleeing. Like a fugitive, Diego would present himself voluntarily before the military authorities, but not alone. He would take with him testimonies, witnesses, proof that his desertion had saved innocent lives. "It will be like a public trial," explained Isabella while writing letters to contacts Miguel had mentioned. "But instead of defending yourself after being arrested, you'll defend yourself before showing you have nothing to hide." The preparation took 3 intense days. Miguel galloped across the region, contacting survivors of the massacre. Diego had prevented gathering written testimonies, convincing former companions in arms to come testify in his favor. Isabella used the social skills she had learned in her aristocratic education to draft formal petitions, convincing letters addressed to civil authorities, a communication strategy that would present Diego's case not as that of a deserter, but as that of a misunderstood hero. On the 4th day they were ready. The party that headed to the settlement where the Federals waited was impressive. Diego and Isabella led the group, followed by more than 20 people, complete families, who owed their survival to Diego's decisions. Former soldiers who had served under his command, even a priest who had witnessed the events in question. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Delgado, the federal officer in charge of the investigation, didn't expect the man he was looking for to present himself voluntarily with an army of witnesses. He was a career military man accustomed to clear cases where guilt or innocence was determined by strict adherence to received orders. "Lieutenant Diego Herrera," he said, when Diego formally presented himself in the settlement's plaza, "you are under arrest for desertion and disobedience in wartime." "Colonel Delgado," replied Diego with a firm voice, "I present myself voluntarily to clarify the accusations against me and to demonstrate that my actions, although they technically disobeyed orders, saved innocent lives and were morally justified." What followed was extraordinary. For 3 days, in a kind of improvised tribunal established in the settlement's main plaza, a public trial developed that attracted the attention of the entire region. One by one, the witnesses told their stories. Maria Gonzalez, a mother of 4 children, narrated how Diego had evacuated her family minutes before orders to leave no survivors arrived. Father Jose Mendoza explained how Diego had given him time to remove civilian refugees from the church. Former soldiers testified about the moral anguish they had seen in Diego when he received the original orders. Isabella also testified not about the war events, she hadn't been present, but about the character of the man she had come to know. "I saw Diego Herrera face mortal dangers to protect a stranger," she declared before the improvised tribunal. "I saw his agony when he speaks of the decisions he had to make during the war. This is not a man who acts from cowardice or disloyalty. This is a man who, when forced to choose between obeying immoral orders or saving innocent lives, chose humanity over blind obedience." Colonel Delgado listened to all testimonies with the impassive expression of a professional military man. But Isabella could see that each story affected him, that the image of the cowardly deserter he had come to arrest didn't match the complex and morally upright man emerging from the testimonies. At the end of the third day, Delgado made a decision that surprised everyone present. "Lieutenant Herrera," he announced, "after reviewing the evidence presented and hearing the testimonies, I have determined that your actions, although they technically constituted disobedience to direct orders, were motivated by superior moral imperatives. I will recommend to Supreme Command that the charges against you be dropped based on extraordinary mitigating circumstances." The settlement exploded in cheers. Diego remained motionless for a moment, as if he couldn't believe that the nightmare that had pursued him for years had finally ended. Isabella ran to him and threw herself into his arms. "We did it," she whispered against his ear. "We're free." "We're free," repeated Diego. And in those words there was a liberation that went beyond the legal. It was the liberation of a man who had finally found peace with his past. But there was still one more decision to make, one choice that would define not only their legal freedom, but their future happiness. Diego's legal absolution was only the first step toward a deeper and more complete freedom. As they rode back to their home in the hills, both knew they had crossed an irreversible threshold. They were no longer two fugitives hiding from the world. They were two people who had faced their demons and had emerged victorious, transformed by the experience. The house under reconstruction welcomed them as a tangible symbol of their triumph. The half-raised walls no longer seemed like the remains of destruction, but the skeleton of a new life taking shape. That night, sitting among the new beams under a star-sown sky, Diego took Isabella's hands in his. "There's something I need to ask," he said, and in his voice there was a solemnity she had never heard. "During all these months we've lived as if we were husband and wife, but without the words that make it official. Do you think it's time to remedy this situation?" Isabella felt her heart accelerate, not from surprise. She had expected this moment, but from the depth of emotion that overcame her. "Are you asking me to marry you, Diego Alejandro Herrera de la Cruz?" "I'm asking you to be my wife before God and before men," he replied. "To take my name, not because you have to, but because you want to build a future together that is completely ours." Isabella's response didn't need words. She leaned toward him and kissed him with a passion that contained all the joy, love, and hope that had grown between them through all the trials they had faced. "Yes," she murmured against his lips. 1,000 times yes. The wedding was planned. For a week later, the time necessary to send invitations to the people who had been with them during the most difficult moments. It wouldn't be an aristocratic ceremony like the one Isabella had fled from, but an authentic celebration of true love. Miguel offered to be best man, and surprisingly a letter also arrived from Don Fernando announcing that he and Doña Carmen would attend the ceremony. "If my daughter has found happiness," he wrote, "then it's my duty as a father to be present to bless that happiness." The wedding day dawned with crystalline clarity that made the hills seem painted with golden brushstrokes. Isabella dressed in a simple but beautiful dress she had sewn herself using fabric she had bought in the settlement, with money earned working alongside Diego. It was white, but not the virginal white of aristocratic weddings, but the white of a new life, of a new beginning. The ceremony took place outdoors in the same place where the original house had stood. Father Jose Mendoza, who had come especially to officiate, had commented that it was appropriate for the marriage to be celebrated among the ashes of the previous life and the beams of the new life they were building. When Diego saw Isabella walking toward him on her father's arm, who had insisted on giving this last paternal gesture despite everything that had happened, he felt his heart expand until it filled his entire chest. She was radiant not only from the physical beauty she had always possessed, but from the inner light she had developed during her transformation. "Diego," said Father Mendoza, when the moment for vows arrived, "do you take Isabella as your wife, to love and respect her in abundance and scarcity and health and sickness for all the days of your life?" "I do," replied Diego, and his voice resonated clear and strong among the hills. "I love her not only for what she is, but for what she helped me become. I promise to be her companion, her protector when she needs it, her equal always and the guardian of her dreams until my last breath." "Isabella," continued the priest, "do you take Diego as your husband to love and respect him in abundance and scarcity, in health and sickness for all the days of your life?" Isabella looked Diego in the eyes, seeing in them not only the man who had saved her, but the companion she had chosen to walk with for the rest of her life. "I do," she said, and her voice was firm as the rock on which they were building their new house. "I love him for his courage, for his kindness, for his ability to see in me the woman I could become. I promise to be his companion in all endeavors, his refuge in storms and the guardian of his heart, until death separates us." When they kissed as husband and wife, the cheers of the guests rose to the sky like a prayer of gratitude. The sun was beginning to decline, painting the entire landscape with golden tones that made the moment seem touched by the divine. The celebration continued until late at night. There was music, dancing, stories shared around the fire. Don Fernando, surprisingly relaxed, conversed at length with Diego about agriculture and construction, finding in him a more prepared and intelligent man than he had initially supposed. "Take good care of my daughter," he told him when the night was coming to an end. "With my life," replied Diego. "But more importantly, I will respect her freedom to continue being who she chose to be." Don Fernando nodded, finally understanding that he had lost an obedient daughter, but had gained a happy one. When they were finally alone, Diego and Isabella walked hand in hand to what would be their room in the new house. The future stretched before them like unexplored territory, full of possibilities. "What are you thinking?" asked Diego, seeing the contemplative expression on his brand new wife's face. "I'm thinking that a year ago I was a prisoner of my own destiny," replied Isabella, "and now I'm the architect of my own life. I think that true love isn't just finding the right person, but becoming the right person alongside her." Diego embraced her under the starlight, feeling they had arrived not at the end of their story, but at its true beginning. "Mrs. Isabella Herrera," he murmured, testing how the name sounded. "It sounds perfect," she replied, and in that perfection they found the promise of all the happy days to come. A year after their wedding, Isabella woke in the finished house with the sensation of living in a dream made reality. The construction had turned out beautiful, cozier than the original, designed by two people who had learned exactly what they needed to be happy. The library had filled with books that Diego bought on his trips to the settlement, feeding the thirst for knowledge Isabella had never lost. Diego's workshop had become a space where he created not only utilitarian objects, but works of art that he sold to passing merchants. She got up carefully, trying not to wake Diego, and walked to the window facing east. The rising sun painted the hills with the same golden tones she had seen at their wedding, but now those colors belonged to her, formed part of her daily life instead of being an exceptional gift. Her hands instinctively rested on her belly, where the most tangible evidence of the new life they had built together was growing. It was still early in the pregnancy, but she already felt how this small being altered not only her body, but also her perspectives on the future. "Good morning, Mrs. Herrera," murmured Diego from the bed, his voice hoarse with sleep but full of love. "Good morning, my husband," replied Isabella, turning to smile at him. "How did you know I was awake?" "Because I always know when you're not beside me," he replied, getting up to join her at the window. "It's as if a part of me automatically wakes when the other part is missing." They embraced in the golden silence of morning, contemplating the lands they now called home. In the distance, they could see the first signs of activity in the settlement, columns of smoke rising from chimneys, tiny figures beginning their daily tasks, life following its tranquil course. "Do you ever regret anything?" asked Diego, as if reading, a question floating in the morning air. Isabella considered the question seriously, as she always did. It was one of the things Diego loved most about her, her ability to honestly examine her feelings without being carried away by automatic responses. "Sometimes I miss the books," she confessed. "Live music, intellectual debates, the comfort of having servants take care of everything. But regret? No. I never regret choosing love over comfort, freedom over security." Diego kissed her temple softly. "I do regret something," he murmured. Isabella tensed momentarily. "What?" "That it took me 32 years to find you," he replied, and his smile removed all worry from her mind. "All the years I lost living halfway before knowing what it meant to be truly alive." They prepared for the day with the loving routine they had developed. He took care of the coffee, while she prepared breakfast, exchanging casual kisses when they crossed paths in the kitchen, planning the day's tasks together. It was a domestic dance that would have bored the aristocratic Isabella, but that filled the woman she had become with joy. After breakfast, they walked together to what was now their back garden. Isabella had managed to cultivate the roses she had planted months ago, and now they bloomed in colors that competed with the sunsets. Diego had carved wooden benches where they sat in the afternoons to plan the future. "I've been thinking about names," said Isabella while settling on one of the benches. Diego sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "For the baby." She nodded. "If it's a girl, I'd like to call her Esperanza, for this place that gave us hope when we needed it most." "I like it," smiled Diego. "And if it's a boy?" "Alejandro, like his father," replied Isabella without hesitation. "So he carries the name of a man who had the courage to defend what was right, even when it cost him everything." Diego felt emotion close his throat. "Do you know what that means to me?" he murmured. "I think I do," replied Isabella. "The same thing you mean to me, proof that true love isn't a fairy tale, but something real that can transform entire lives." They spent the rest of the morning working together in the garden they had expanded this year. Isabella had demonstrated a natural talent for agriculture, and her vegetables were now known throughout the settlement for their quality. Diego took care of repairs and improvements to the house, always finding small projects that would make their home more comfortable and beautiful. At midday, Miguel arrived with news from the outside world. He brought newspapers from the capital, letters from old acquaintances, and the inevitable gossip that circulated through the region. "Don Rodrigo Velasco finally got married," he announced, while they drank lemonade on the porch. "To a banker's daughter from the capital. They say it was a very convenient marriage for both families." Isabella felt a pang of something that wasn't nostalgia, but compassion. "I hope they're happy," she said sincerely. "Really?" asked Miguel, surprised. "Of course," replied Isabella. "No one deserves to be trapped in a loveless marriage. If they found a way to make a commercial arrangement work, I'm glad for them." Diego smiled, admiring once more the generosity of spirit that had been one of the first things that made him fall in love with Isabella. When Miguel left, Diego and Isabella remained alone on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western hills. It was their favorite moment of the day, when work had ended and they could simply exist together. "Do you know what I think when I see sunsets like this?" asked Isabella. "What? That we're writing a completely new story," she replied. "Not the story others wrote for us, not the story of our past mistakes, but a story we choose to create day by day with our decisions." Diego nodded. "A love story that survived the storms." "And that will continue surviving," added Isabella, placing her hand on her belly where the future was growing, "because now we have roots deep enough to resist any storm." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Diego and Isabella Herrera embraced on the porch of the house they had built. With their own hands, surrounded by the hills, that had witnessed their transformation from two lost souls into a family united by true love. They had learned that happiness wasn't a destination one arrives at, but a path one chooses to walk each day. And they had chosen to walk it together, facing the future with the certainty that true love, when mutual and honest, can create miracles that transcend all the barriers the world tries to impose. In the hills of Santa Esperanza, where two wounded hearts had found healing in shared love, a new story continued to be written, with each dawn promising that some love stories are destined to last forever.